Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Michael Blanding for his book, North by Shakespeare. My name is Bree. I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have all of you join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of Michael and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other people in the audience. I have a feeling Michael's going to be a little bit too busy to be reading the chat. If you have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. I have a feeling chat's going to keep moving really quickly, so if you ask a question in the chat, it will probably get lost. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Michael Blanding, our guest of honor, is a Boston-based investigative journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Slate, the Boston Globe Magazine, Boston Magazine, and other publications. A former journalism fellow at Brandeis University and Harvard Law School, he has taught feature writing at Tufts University, Emerson College, and Grub Street Writers. The book we're celebrating tonight, which you can see the beautiful cover of, is North by Shakespeare, a rogue scholar's quest for the truth behind Shakespeare's work. It is a true story of a self-taught Shakespeare sleuth's quest to prove his eye-opening theory about the source of the world's most famous plays, taking readers inside the vibrant era of Elizabethan England, as well as the contemporary scene of Shakespeare scholars and obsessives. Renegade scholar Dennis Mccarthy believes that Sir Thomas North, an Elizabethan courtier, is the undiscovered source of Shakespeare's plays. McCarthy's wholly original conclusion is this: Shakespeare wrote the plays, but he adapted them from source plays written by North decades before. It's my pleasure to have you all with us tonight and to welcome Michael Blanding. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Bree, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for coming to see me tonight, talk about my new book, North by Shakespeare. And I have to say, this is totally a bizarre way to give a presentation. I know there's hundreds of people on the other side of the screen, and yet I can't see any of you, but you can see me. And when I originally thought about giving my book launch, when I first started working on this book about 2 years ago, this is not quite what I expected, but it has the unexpected benefit of having people join us from all over the world, at least 3 continents that I know of. So I'm so pleased that you could all join me, and there is no place that I would rather hold a book launch, either virtual or in person, than Brookline Booksmith, my hometown bookstore, one of the best bookstores in Boston, if not the world. And so I'm so pleased to be holding my event with Booksmith tonight. Now, I'm going to talk for about a half an hour and tell you a little bit about the book. Hopefully, it won't flood you with too much information, but I have created a lot of pretty slides for you to look at least. And then towards the end of the hour, we will have enough time, hopefully, for Q&A, and I can answer your questions about the book. So for starters, I just want to acknowledge that I'm so pleased that so many people have come to a presentation about William Shakespeare. I know that for some people, he is not their favorite subject, and those people may identify with one observer who says that Shakespeare often obscures his meanings by his words and sometimes makes it unintelligible. And that was poet John Dryden in 1679. So there's a long history of people being annoyed with Shakespeare and Shakespeare's language. And I appreciate that some people may still feel like they are recovering from the trauma of having Shakespeare inflicted upon them in high school. But whether you are a Shakespeare hater, a Shakespeare lover, or a Shakespeare agnostic, I think we have to acknowledge that there is no other writer in the world who has had so much of an influence on our culture than William Shakespeare and the characters that he's created. Whether it's the wit of Beatrice and Falstaff, the heroism of Henry V or Rosalind, or the villainy of Richard III, Iago, or Lady Macbeth, Shakespeare has created indelible characters that continue to influence us in our culture 400 years later. And I think it's safe to say that there is no other writer who has been more often reinterpreted, adapted, parodied, and translated into every language in the world. And the 38 plays that Shakespeare wrote in his lifetime may be the closest that we have to a shared culture around the world. It's been said that at every moment, every hour of every day, there's Shakespeare being performed somewhere around the world. And that may have only fallen off slightly during the pandemic when Zoom Shakespeare has become a thing. So the question that I ask in my book is, where do these stories come from that have influenced us so profoundly? And on the one hand, it's a very easy question to answer. Conventionally, they were written by William Shakespeare. He wrote these plays in several decades. He was born in 1564. He died in 1616. Half of his plays were published during his lifetime in quarto format. The other half were published after his death in the first folio. On the other hand, though, the stories that Shakespeare told have a much longer history. As Bill Bryson once said, Shakespeare is a wonderful teller of stories so long as someone else had told them first. Among the sources used for Shakespeare's plays are Italian novellas, the English chronicles of Holinshed and Hall, and the Roman biographies in Plutarch's Lives. In fact, many scholars believe that Shakespeare also used source plays written by other writers that he adapted into his work. And many of these plays have been lost, which is not unusual. Of the 3,000 plays written in the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, it's estimated that we only have 10% of them today, and we only know another 10% of their names. But given those names, scholars have surmised that these are the lost sources of Shakespeare's plays. For example, a play called Phoenicia may have been a source for Much Ado About Nothing. Philemon and Philistia may have been the source for Two Gentlemen of Verona. Even Romeo and Juliet, there is evidence that there was a play written decades before Shakespeare's plays that he may have adapted into his own work. And then there's other plays that still survive today that may be thought of as companion plays to Shakespeare. And oftentimes they have very similar names to Shakespeare's plays, but they were written by another writer. And it's an open debate about whether these plays inspired Shakespeare, whether Shakespeare inspired these plays, or whether they were both inspired by now lost plays that we no longer know about. Now, the scholar that I talk about in my book, the rogue scholar of the title, is named Dennis Mccarthy. And he is someone who believes that Shakespeare had source plays for nearly every one of his works. And where he parts company with conventional scholarship, however, is that he believes that every one of these source plays was written by the same writer. And that writer is Sir Thomas North, who was an Elizabethan courtier and the translator of Plutarch's Lives, upon which Shakespeare based his Roman plays. And Dennis believes that Thomas North, over a 50-year career, wrote source plays for all of Shakespeare's works, which then Shakespeare adapted into his own plays. And when he had first told me this theory, I have to say that I did not believe a word of it. I thought that it was an outlandish idea, and I was only sort of vaguely aware of theories that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, that his plays were written by another writer like the Earl of Oxford or Sir Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe. But this seemed like a really different idea, that Shakespeare wrote the plays, but that he was adapting this work by this other writer and making it his own and putting his name on it. As Dennis started sending me more information about his theories, however, I found it very compelling. And in particular, early on, he showed me this manuscript that he had discovered at the British Library, which no one had really looked at before, which was written by George North, who's a likely cousin of Thomas North. And this manuscript, he used computer software, plagiarism software, to compare to the works of William Shakespeare. And he determined that it was the source for 11 of Shakespeare's plays, including Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear. Eventually, he published a book on this manuscript, along with scholar June Schluter. And this book was recognized by scholars as many of whom embraced it, and one of whom called it a once-in-a-generation find about Shakespeare. By this point, I'd been talking with Dennis for about 3 years, and I pitched a story to the New York Times based on this book, and it ran on the front page under the title Plagiarism Software unveils a new source for 11 of Shakespeare's plays. And again, it was well received and embraced by scholars and the general public, although mostly by people sniggering about the fact that Shakespeare was a plagiarist. But be that as it may, I really thought that there was something to this research that Dennis was doing. The one thing that I did not mention in my article and that Dennis did not mention in his book, however, was this larger theory about Thomas North and about the fact that he may have taken the manuscript by George North and other sources and written these plays that Shakespeare later adapted. So I approached him after this article, and at this point, Dennis had had a hard time getting that theory out in the world. He tried through conferences, through papers. He was trying to write a book of his own, and he was running into a lot of pushback from other scholars about this idea. And so I proposed that I would write a book and I would write about his ideas, but I would also write about him and his quest to prove these ideas. Now, the first thing you should know about Dennis is that he's not a traditional scholar. In fact, he barely graduated from high school. He dropped out of college just a few credits shy of graduating. And he spent his 20s in what he himself calls a bit of a wild period, where he did a lot of drinking and partying and playing ultimate frisbee, which he was on a team that actually was internationally ranked for ultimate frisbee. But at the same time, he was always really intelligent and he read voraciously. He was particularly interested in the subject of science. And so when he finally settled down and moved to New Hampshire and got married, he stayed home with the children as a stay-at-home dad, and he began to write about these scientific discoveries that he was researching. And in fact, he wrote a book called Here Be Dragons, which looked at how species of plants and animals move around the world. And it was well received by the scientific community as well as the general public. And it was that book, surprisingly, that led him to look at Shakespeare. He figured if he could look at how plants and animals move around the world, then what if he looked at how a story moved around the world and how it was taken up by different cultures and reinterpreted? And with a maximum amount of hubris, the story that he chose was the greatest story in literature, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, Hamlet was not originated by William Shakespeare. The tale goes back to a Norse legend that goes back at least to the 11th century, probably earlier. And it journeys to England through a French version that was published in 1564. And then Shakespeare first published his play in 1603 in a version known as the First Quarto. Fun fact, instead of to be or not to be, that is the question. The First Quarto says to be or not to be, aye, there's the point. So lucky for us that he continued to work on the play, and the later versions assumed it's more familiar phrasing for the soliloquy. And it appeared in other quarto formats and then eventually in the first folio. As Dennis started researching Shakespeare's play, however, he found that there was actually an earlier version of Hamlet that predates Shakespeare in English that some scholars refer to as the Ur-Hamlet. It is mentioned in a 1589 work by Thomas Nash, who talks about this writer named English Seneca. And he says, if you entreat him fair in a frosty morning, he will afford you whole Hamlets, in a sort of mocking tone. Now, Seneca was a first century Roman tragedian who is known for writing very particularly bloody tragedies. And Hamlet is known as a sort of latter day Senecan tragedy. So this English Seneca, Mccarthy surmised, was an English writer who was a writer of Senecan tragedies and penned this original Ur-Hamlet. And so he set out to determine who that writer might be. And he started finding other clues, like Nash referred to a translator of Plutarch. And as I said, Sir Thomas North was the translator of Plutarch's Lives. And then he referred to getting Boreas by the beard. And Boreas is another name for the north wind. And so if you think Thomas North and north wind, again, it sort of seems to be pointing in Thomas North's direction. And as Mccarthy started researching the life of Thomas North, he found another reference much earlier that combined North and Seneca together. And this was one of the first translators of Seneca who sort of appealed to other writers to translate Seneca as well. And he went to the Inns of Court, which were these Tudor law schools at the time. And he said, at Lincoln's Inn, you can find the self-same North, whose dial doth of princes paint. And McCarthy discovered that that was a reference to Thomas North's first translation called The Dial of Princes, which is this sort of instruction manual for rulers about how to rule their kingdoms. And as he started reading The Dial of Princes, he found these passages that were remarkably similar to Hamlet, and in particular, Hamlet's soliloquy, in which he says, and I won't try to perform this, but he says, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. And in North's prose, he said, is it better that thou die or thou escape and live, to be or not to be? He talks about the assaults of life and broils of fortune, like the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. He refers to death as a kind of sleeping, which Hamlet does as well. And he refers to a pilgrimage uncertain, the way that Hamlet refers to an undiscovered country. And in fact, he was able to take Hamlet's soliloquy in its entirety and match it up to phrases in North's work in which he was either using the exact same words or very close approximations that had the same meaning. And from this, he deduced that Thomas North was indeed this English Seneca, this author of the Hamlet. And he was able to actually publish a scholarly paper to that effect in Oxford University Press. Now, as he started looking more deeply into this, however, he started finding all of these other references to Thomas North that also seemed to be connected to Shakespeare's plays, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream and Macbeth. And he began to come to the uneasy conclusion that maybe North wasn't just the author of the original Hamlet, but maybe he was the author of other plays of Shakespeare's canon. And as he was reading the textbooks or the works of the period, the texts of the period, he came across one that was particularly interesting called Green's Groatsworth of Wit. And this is actually the first reference to Shakespeare, and it refers to him as an upstart crow who sort of takes other writers' works and passes them off as his own. And this work has been referred to by both Shakespeareans and proponents of other writers of Shakespeare as saying that Shakespeare was not always original in his plays and that he adopted the plays of others. And in fact, as McCarthy began reading further into this work, he actually found a dialogue between this Shakespeare character, this country actor who was this Shakespeare character, and this gentleman scholar who the actor was actually buying plays from. And he says, men in my profession get by scholars their whole living. And the gentleman scholar says, but how do you mean to use me? And the actor says, why, sir, in making plays for which you will be well paid if you will take the pains. And so it's this remarkable passage that seems to imply anyway that Shakespeare was buying plays from this other writer. And of course, McCarthy saw that other writer as being Thomas North. So who is Thomas North? As McCarthy began to research this, he discovered that Thomas North was a gentleman who lived in Cambridgeshire, England. His father was a wealthy lord who was very high up in the court under Henry VIII. His brother was also a wealthy lord who was the household treasurer for Queen Elizabeth eventually. And so they were very prominent nobles in Elizabethan and Tudor England. Thomas North, on the other hand, was essentially disowned from his family at some point, first by his father and then by his brother. But he did translate these three translations, The Dial of Princes, The Moral Philosophy of Donny, and Plutarch's Lives. And then aside from that, he lived this amazing life as a lawyer, as a soldier, as a diplomat, and traveled all over Europe and had a number of experiences, which is significant because one of the reasons why people doubt Shakespeare's authorship of the plays is that he doesn't seem to have had the biography in order to have the experience to use the kind of language he uses in the plays, where he uses complex legal language. He talks about a soldier being at war in a way that sounds like he himself was familiar with going to war. He talks about the intrigues at court, and he talks especially about travel to Italy, which McCarthy found that Thomas North actually went to Italy as well. And so as he started to look further into Thomas North's life, he began to find other connections which implied that perhaps Thomas North was the author of these plays. For example, in 1551, there was a murder that occurred where Thomas North's half-sister, a woman by the name of Alice Arden, she conspired with her lover to murder her husband, who was a North family protege of Thomas's father. And this murder was adapted 40 years later into a play called Arden of Feversham. And this play actually is believed by some people to be one of Shakespeare's early plays. And in fact, 3 years ago, it was actually named as by Shakespeare and Anonymous. And that anonymous co-author, Mccarthy believes, is Thomas North, who wrote an earlier version of this play years earlier. And to come to that conclusion, again, he used this computer software and he found hundreds of parallel passages that connected Arden of Feversham with North's Dial of Princes. I'll just point out one, which is the subtitle of the play itself, wherein is showed the great malice and dissimulation of a wicked woman. And in North's Dial, he says, wherein is expressed the great malice and little patience of an evil woman. So almost the exact same phrase expressing the exact same idea. In 1555, Thomas North went on a delegation to Rome, and he visited a strange church that had these lifelike wax statues. And then he went to a palace called the Palazzo Te that had these amazing frescoes by an artist named Giulio Romano of all these pagan gods and goddesses. Now, Giulio Romano is significant because he's the only Renaissance artist that Shakespeare mentions in his plays. And he mentions him in the play The Winter's Tale, in which he also talks about a statue that comes to life. And that statue is made by, quote, that rare Italian master, Giulio Romano. And scholars have never been able to understand how Shakespeare could have known about this artist who was relatively obscure at the time and was not known as a sculptor. And in fact, The Winter's Tale also includes this pastoral feast that has many of the same gods and goddesses that are included in the frescoes at Palazzo Te. And Mccarthy found a journal that Thomas North kept on this trip. And he looked at the passages and he read actual passages where Thomas North talks about visiting these locations. And again, with June Schluter, he wrote a book where he actually transcribed the journal and wrote a passage showing how this journal was the source for many passages, both in The Winter's Tale and in the play Henry VIII. And in fact, he argues that The Winter's Tale is an allegory for the story of Henry VIII, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and his daughter, Queen Mary, who was the queen that sent North on that delegation along with other people in 1555. Most of the plays in the canon, however, Mccarthy argues are written by North, at least the source plays were written by North on behalf of his patron, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was a longtime companion to Queen Elizabeth, and in fact spent many years trying to woo Elizabeth for her hand in marriage. In 1575, he held a festival at his castle of Kenilworth that lasted for 19 days, in which he tried to convince Elizabeth to marry him. And many scholars believe that this festival was the inspiration for Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. They have a harder time explaining how Shakespeare would have written about this festival since he was only 11 years old in 1575 when it happened. But we know that Thomas North's brother, Roger, attended the festival, and more than likely, Thomas attended as well. Now, Leicester not only tried to marry Queen Elizabeth himself, but he was also sort of famous for trying to prevent anyone else from marrying Queen Elizabeth. And he employed writers often to write these sort of mocking plays or essays against these other foreign suitors that were vying for Elizabeth's hand. And McCarthy believes that he used North for this same purpose, and that many of these mocking portrayals of Elizabeth's suitors have actually made their way into Shakespeare's plays. For example, in 1561, Elizabeth was wooed by Eric XIV of Sweden. And McCarthy believes that he was referred to in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus in which a Roman emperor sort of meets his doom when he marries this foreign queen, this Goth queen. Now, Eric of Sweden was not just the king of Sweden, his full title was the King of Sweden and the Goths. So McCarthy sees sort of a veiled reference there, warning Elizabeth against marrying this foreign suitor. That handsome gentleman in the middle is Don John of Austria. And McCarthy believes that in 1574, Thomas North wrote a play called Phoenicia, which was the source for Much Ado About Nothing. And Much Ado About Nothing features as its villain Don John. And he is frequently referred to in the play as a bastard, just as Don John of Austria was the bastard brother of King Philip of Spain. Now, the young man on the right is Hercule Francois, the Duke of Alençon from France. And he was a longtime suitor who vied for Elizabeth's hand. And McCarthy argues that many of the anti-French sentiments in Shakespeare's history are actually veiled attacks on Alençon, including most appropriately in Henry VI, Part 1, which actually features an ancestor of the Duke of Alençon, who is painted as a coward, and he's bested by this English hero Talbot, who is actually an ancestor of the Earl of Leicester. Now, Shakespeare scholars have not necessarily realized or emphasizing these links to these historical characters, but the simple fact that when Shakespeare wrote his plays, these characters would not have been relevant for Shakespeare. Don John and Alençon were both dead, and Eric had gone mad. And so it's only by interpreting them through plays written as source plays decades earlier that they could be seen to be relevant. I won't go into Thomas North's entire life, but what was particularly fascinating to me, and what I wrote about to some extent in the book, is that McCarthy is able to do this with Thomas North for every one of Shakespeare's plays and work it into a chronology of Thomas's life in which the events of the plays either refer to things that were going on in North's life or in the life of his patron, Robert Dudley. He even has a reason why North would be writing so much about death in his composition of the Hamlet in 1588, in which he was a captain who was in charge of defending England against the attack by the Spanish Armada, which was this incredibly fearsome army that everyone believed was going to conquer England. And North was in a particularly precarious position in which he was actually facing the very real possibility of his own death. As I said before, however, it's not just the life of Thomas North that McCarthy finds the evidence for Shakespeare's plays, but he also looked very intensely at the language of Thomas North and used his plagiarism software techniques to compare it to Shakespeare's plays. And he took rather than sort of using this plagiarism software as a professor might to catch a student who was plagiarizing something on the internet, he took all of Thomas North's writing and all of Shakespeare's plays, and he looked at them together to see how many common phrases he could find. And then when he found a common phrase, he would look it up on other databases to see if anybody else had used that phrase. And he found hundreds of passages and thousands of individual phrases that were either unique or rare that Shakespeare and Thomas North used. Now, everyone knows and agrees that Shakespeare used Thomas North's Plutarch's Lies for his Roman plays, but it's really remarkable when you actually look at the plays side by side with Plutarch's Lies, with this plagiarism software. Oftentimes people say that yes, Shakespeare used North's text, but he with his genius, he embellished them and he made them greater than they were. But when you look at them side by side, it's really amazing how he, in many cases, took passages word for word and just turned the prose into poetry for these plays. And he did the same thing with Julius Caesar and with Coriolanus. And it wasn't just the Roman plays that McCarthy found that there were similar phrases between Thomas North and Shakespeare, but he was able to show this for every play in the canon except for two. This is a screenshot of McCarthy's website, sirthomasnorth.com, and I invite you to check it out. Some of these correlations between these phrases you might find more compelling than others. But I really invite you to go to Dennis's website and look at them for yourself. And what was really surprising and really remarkable for me was that it wasn't just these phrases of 3, 4, 5 words that he found in common between Shakespeare's writing and Thomas North's writing, but there are these whole passages in which Shakespeare was expressing the exact same idea in the exact same context as Thomas North. And I realize these are scrolling by too fast for you to actually look at them in any detail, but I just wanted to show you just the sheer number of these passages that he's able to find these common threads. And I'm just going to hone in on 2 of them now, just to give you an example of what it is I mean and what it is that McCarthy argues. So in 1570, Thomas North wrote a translation called The Moral Philosophy of Donny. And it is this collection of animal fables that comes from Italy. And it is believed that he actually went to Italy to collect these fables, and which were published in Venice at the time. And right around that time is when Venice was being invaded by the Turks, which is the time in which Othello is set, Shakespeare's play Othello is set. In this translation, there's one animal tale about this mule, sort of duplicitous mule, who tries to plot to take over the kingdom from this lion. And there's this scene in the beginning of the tale in which he talks to his confidant, the ass. And he talks about how bitter he is about being passed over for promotion and how he's going to turn the lion's lieutenant, the bull, against him. And that's how he's going to take over the kingdom. And almost the exact same scene occurs in the first act of Shakespeare's Othello, in which the villain Iago talks to his confidant, Rodrigo, and talks about how bitter he is for being passed over for promotion, and how he's going to turn Othello's lieutenant, Cassio, against him, and he's going to bring about Othello's downfall. And not only is the idea similar, but much of the language is seemingly drawn straight from North. In North, he talks about how the mule's provender pricked him, the coarse animal feed, made him bitter. And in Othello, Iago says that some men are content to serve like his master's ass for naught but provender. The mule says that he's not going to use the pen of his heart to write his thoughts on his forehead. And Iago says that he will not wear his heart upon his sleeve. The mule says, "Tell me not of honesty or dishonesty, tut, a fig." And Iago says, "Virtue, a fig, 'tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus." The mule talks about a double treason. Iago talks about a double knavery. The mule talks about leading the bull by the nose. And Iago talks about leading Othello by the nose, as asses are. So it's this remarkable passage in which all of these ideas seem drawn from North. And now you could argue that Shakespeare was just really interested in North and obsessed with all of his translations, not just Plutarch's Lives, and he just read this book and he took this passage from North and turned it into his own play. But there's another passage that makes that more complicated. This is one in Richard II, in which one of the characters talks about grief. And she describes grief as being like seeing things through water, in which everything is distorted. And then she uses this rare phrase where she talks about dissolving the bands of life. And North uses the same words and the same idea in one of his translations of Nepo's Lives, which is this sort of addendum to Plutarch's Lives, which he published in 1602. And he also talks about grief as seeing things through water. And he also talks about dissolving the bands of life. And the reason this is complicated is because Shakespeare's Richard II was published in 1597, and North's translation was not published until 1602. And so you would have to argue that Shakespeare was using North's translation before it was published, or somehow it had access to North's private papers. So at the very least, then it implies some connection between Shakespeare and North that scholars have not known about. And for that reason alone, I think it's worth examining. I'm just going to wrap up here by telling you a little bit about the writing of the book, and then we'll open it up to questions. But when I first proposed to McCarthy the idea of writing this book, he agreed that he would, he would be okay with me writing about his ideas and giving them a wider audience. But I realized that it wasn't really going to make sense to have two guys sitting across the table talking about ideas for a whole book. So I proposed that we actually go to some of these locations in the book and actually walk in Thomas North's footsteps, see what we could find in those areas, and at the very least have conversations in those areas that might bring some of these works alive. And as it so happened, Dennis's daughter, Nicole, was working on a documentary about her father's work. And we decided to join forces, and we all went together on 2 trips to England and to Italy and France. And we went to many of those locations, and Nicole filmed and I interviewed Dennis, and I kept my independence as a journalist. We didn't work together, but we sort of worked alongside each other, and we actually had a lot of fun doing it. So here we are at Kenilworth Castle, which is a ruin that you can still visit today. There's Dennis trying to determine where Thomas North might have been at the Kenilworth Festival. On the right is us at Kirtling Hall, Thomas North's boyhood home, which technically we were not allowed to actually visit, but I assure you that is public land we are standing on, that we got a glimpse of Kirtling from afar. We went to the Palazzo Te, and we went to that church in Mantua with the strange wax statues. And this was particularly fun because this is the first time that Dennis actually saw these frescoes in person that he had been writing about for so long. You can see the excitement on his face as we got to see them together. And imagine Thomas North sitting in this room, having this dinner and staring at this amazing tableau. Of course, we also had to go to Venice, and we had a good time traveling around Venice for the day. There's me at the Bridge of Sighs with a very picturesquely placed gondola in the background. There's Dennis along the Grand Canal, and there's Nicole and one of the camera persons that she was working with, Ian, who are standing on the Rialto Bridge. And we went to not only Venice, but also Padua, to Rome, and to Verona. And in each location, we went to these locations and we tried to see what clues we could find about whether Thomas North had actually visited them himself. I also did my own research for the book. It was very important to me that I not just take Dennis's word for it, and that I try to do my own research and either prove or disprove his theories, or at the very least complicate his theories. And I have to say that as much as I tried to find holes in them, for the most part, what I found corroborated Dennis's evidence rather than finding fault in it. These are some documents I found at the National Archives in London that referred to Thomas's father, Edward North, and a treason trial that he was a part of against King Henry VIII, and actually corroborates some of the themes of the play Henry VIII by Shakespeare that McCarthy was investigating. That's actually Henry VIII's signature on the left there, which was just so cool to look at these documents. I went to the British Library and spent a lot of time there. I went to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and literally spent the whole month of July in 2019 in London doing this research. And thank God I finished it before the pandemic struck, so that I could spend the pandemic writing rather than being worried about not doing this research. But most significantly, I looked at a copy of Thomas North's own personal copy of the Dial of Princes that was at Cambridge University Library. And if there's one fault that I find in Dennis's research techniques, it's that he spends so much time on the computer that he did not actually go and look at this copy, which contains Thomas North's own handwriting and underlining and marginalia. And in this copy of the Dial of Princes, you can see right at the top image there is Thomas North's signature with the date 1591. And the first thing that jumped out at me when I looked at this was that he had underlined a passage in the table of contents, "The Great Malice and Little Patience of an Evil Woman," which, as you recall, is the subtitle of Arden of Feversham, which Dennis believes Thomas North wrote. And if you remember the chronology, Arden of Feversham was published in 1592. So it is coincidental, to say the least, that Thomas North was underlining that phrase a year before that play was published. Moreover, however, I found a number of passages that jumped out at me that seemed to reference similar passages in Macbeth. There was one in which he underlined this passage about these strange foods that people ate, like lizards and broth and fried frogs, and then immediately brought to mind the frogs and lizards in the broth that boiled and bubbled from the witches in Macbeth. And there were other other phrases too. There were a number of phrases that really strangely talked about breastfeeding and breast milk. And if people know about Macbeth, there's all these weird allusions to breastfeeding and breast milk. When Lady Macbeth says, you're too full of the milk of human kindness to her husband to commit this murder, or take my milk and replace it with gall. And then finally, there was this one passage that really jumped out at me where Thomas North referred to a wicked man as a candle. And he said, once a wicked man starts doing evil acts, he doesn't finish until he burns out like a candle. And of course, that called to mind Macbeth's famous soliloquy at the end of the play when he says, out, out, brief candle, right before he's killed. And, really captures the theme of Macbeth, in which Macbeth just commits one evil act after another. And what was particularly striking about this was that, again, McCarthy hadn't seen any of this when I showed it to him, but he had already predetermined that due to events in Thomas North's life, that he had written the source play for Macbeth in 1591. And so again, it was just this uncanny coincidence. And, the whole time I was writing this book, I kept questioning myself and I kept asking, am I just seeing what I want to see here? Am I being seduced by Dennis's theories and seeing something that's not there? But this was one instance in which I had found something completely independently that corroborated Dennis' theories in this strange way. Just to wrap up, I wanted to give a shout out to June Schluter, who is Dennis's co-author on these two books and his collaborator on much of this research. And June was really the only scholar to date who's really embraced Dennis's theories. She was initially very skeptical when he presented them to her, but over time, he really won her over with a lot of his ideas. And in turn, she really taught Dennis how to take his ideas and to write them in this academic format in which they could possibly be accepted by other scholars. And so in many ways, June is really the heart of my book, and she really bears a significant role in developing these theories and in writing about them and making them in a form that they can be actually pass the scholarly muster and be taken seriously. On the other hand, however, it will not surprise you to learn that there are very few scholars who have really embraced Dennis's theories. And, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that, sometimes like with the George North manuscript, when it's just a small part of the theories and they say, oh, this is just a source for Shakespeare, they're willing to accept that. But the idea that Shakespeare borrowed all of these plays from the source plays of his earlier writers would just undo so much of Shakespeare scholarship that it's really hard for mainstream Shakespeareans to really take seriously. And I think in some ways that's a shame, because whether or not you think that Dennis is 100% correct about his beliefs, it's clear that there is some connection there between Shakespeare and Thomas North. And I really think that it bears investigating. And if it is investigated and if it is shown that Shakespeare used Thomas North's writings, it really has the power to reinterpret and change some of the greatest works of literature ever written. To think that The Winter's Tale is an allegory for Henry VIII, or to think that Henry V was based on wars that Thomas North fought in and was actually written by somebody who was participating in wars at the time, or that Hamlet was written by someone who was facing his own mortality, or King Lear was written by somebody who was in poverty at the time. It's really enriched and deepened my own reading of the plays to think about these possible associations. And I think that it could really enrich other people's readings as well. Now, of course, I've written this book, and so I now have a vested interest in promoting Dennis's theories as well. And so take with a grain of salt everything that I'm saying. I do hope that you read the book, and I hope that you look at Dennis's website and that you're able to draw your own conclusions about these theories and make up your own mind. And I really look forward to hearing your questions and to having a conversation in the time we have left tonight. And thank you for listening to all the information that I've just given you.
All right. It looks like we have some big Dennis and June fans.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So thank you so much. That was a really great presentation.
Thank you.
I was a huge Shakespeare fan in college, so that really spoke to my nerd heart. And we have a lot of really good questions. So I'm just going to get right into it.
Wonderful.
So Scott wants to know if North was a source for Shakespeare, does that mean that Shakespeare did not need to be knowledgeable about the law, falconry, Italy, jousting? Was North his source for this domain knowledge?
That's what Dennis argues. Yeah, that Shakespeare took Norse plays and he adapted them. He may have rewritten them in places. He may have changed the language in places, but that all this knowledge behind the works was actually drawn from Thomas Norse experience and taken by Shakespeare and used for his plays.
Ryan would like to know, how do you hope that your book will influence the way Shakespeare is taught and performed?
Well, I think that there is a trend in scholarship that I look at in the book in which Shakespeare is not seen, even by mainstream scholars anymore, as this sort of solitary genius who just kind of created these plays out of thin air. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that he collaborated with other writers, either wrote these plays together or, as I said, adapted these source plays. And I think that it just makes a lot of sense to me that, you look at how, say shows or movies are created today, and there's a lot of hands that are all working together to create these stories. It's not just one person who creates these things. And so it makes sense to me that Shakespeare's plays would be the same way. And in some ways that makes them more interesting and more exciting to me than to just think that it's one person who just invented all these stories.
So that actually relates to a question further down in my list. Let me just find it. Oh, here we go. This is from an anonymous question asker, perhaps the famous Anonymous. Do you think that North was personally involved with William Shakespeare, or was there sharing or adaptation only via manuscripts? This person recalls a later biographer of Shakespeare claiming that he had sources which claimed a chuckle-pated historian was on his payroll who did all of this historical research and wrote all of it for Shakespeare's use. Do you think that could have been North?
That I don't know. I haven't heard of that source before, but I believe that Dennis feels that Shakespeare and North were acquainted, that there were many different ways in which they may have been familiar with each other. One possible way, for example, is that North's publisher for Plutarch's Lives is actually from Stratford-upon-Avon, so they could have met that way. And that really compelling biography of North or supposed biography of North in Green's Groatsworth of Wit seems to imply some kind of relationship where Shakespeare was actually buying the plays from North, who was impoverished at the time. So it's a really compelling, there's unfortunately, there's no evidence that shows that the two were directly connected, but it's a great thought experiment to imagine them meeting at some, public house in Shoreditch or something and selling these plays across the table or something.
All right. Is The Tempest still considered a Shakespeare original play by Dennis?
Yeah, that is actually a fascinating case study. It is one of the only plays by Shakespeare that there's no known identified source for. But Dennis believes that The Tempest is actually inspired by, among other things, Thomas North's relationship with his brother. And you see these brotherly conflict throughout a lot of Shakespeare plays, actually. As You Like It is another one, Much Ado About Nothing, even Richard III. There's always these brothers that are going at it. And Thomas North had a very tempestuous relationship with his brother. Even from the historical record, you can see that. And so it's a little bit more complicated than this, but essentially that is McCarthy's idea, that he was sort of creating this version in which this exiled Duke Prospero on this island, who was sort of exiled with his books, was a stand-in for Thomas North, and then his brother, who usurped him, was a stand-in for Roger North, his brother, and I won't give any more away than that. But it's really sort of emotionally affecting, actually, his interpretation of how their brotherly conflict is interpreted through this play.
And that question was from Scott. Thank you, Scott. Related, Anonymous would like to know, has McCarthy or anyone else run plagiarism software on the sonnets?
Yeah, that is a question that I anticipated coming up. And I do not include the sonnets in my book. For one, because I just had so much to deal with the plays that my first draft of the book was like twice as long as it was. And so to add one more thing would have been really difficult. But the other thing, the other reason I don't include it is because Mccarthy and I sort of made a deal very early on that I would not write about the sonnets, that he was okay with me writing about the plays and sort of scooping a lot of his research, but that he had also done some research on the sonnets and he wanted to save that for himself to reveal at a later date. So I actually don't even know what Mccarthy has found about the sonnets or how they relate to Shakespeare and Thomas North, but I am eager to find that out. I have some theories, but I'm eager to find that out when he publishes it himself.
Everyone stay tuned.
Exactly.
Crystal says, clearly you've become an expert through all of your research. How deeply familiar with Shakespeare's work were you before you began writing this book?
I was moderately familiar with his work. I had, read a lot of the plays in college, for example, and I'd seen a lot of plays. I was always a fan of Shakespeare. I always liked Shakespeare, but I was by no means an expert. And it's been really an education for me. I thought if I was going to write about Shakespeare, that I really had to know my stuff. And so I reread, I think at this point, 26 of the plays, of the 38 plays. And I watched versions of many of them. I had to give a shout out to The Hollow Crown, which is the BBC adaptation of the historical plays, which is fantastic. But I watched a lot of other versions as well. And I read commentary after commentary. Every single play I read at least 3, if not more, editions of it that would have the introduction of the commentary. And then on top of that, I read a lot of papers as well. So I hope that I imbibed enough of Shakespeare research that I could, write with authority about Shakespeare and his plays. And I'm sure the Shakespeareans will tell me things that I've got wrong even now, but I've tried so hard to get everything right.
All right, Bruce would like to know, what, in your opinion, what effect will Mccarthy's work have going forward on Shakespeare's place in literature? And will North also have a place?
I think that Dennis would like to see him have a place. We visited Stratford upon Avon together, and that was very fun to see just how idolized Shakespeare is in Stratford upon Avon, but really in all of our culture. Shakespeare is looked upon as almost as deity. And again, I think it's more interesting to me to think about Shakespeare's plays as being a collaboration. And if his ideas are accepted, which is obviously a big if, I think it'd be really fascinating to be able to tease out, what was North and what was Shakespeare. And maybe there's elements of the plays that, Shakespeare, perhaps was a theater producer and had his play company. Perhaps he was really responsible for interpreting these plays to the stage and really making them the successes that they were. And Thomas North just sort of provided, a lot of this raw material. We don't know, but I think it could be a really fascinating exploration for people if they're willing to embark upon it, which again is a big if.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris has a question that I was wondering also: on what bias do scholars disagree with Dennis?
Yeah, the main basis that people have for disagreeing with Dennis is they say, if there are these lost plays by Thomas North, where are they? Mm-hmm. If Thomas North wrote 36 plays, why haven't we seen any of them before? And I think Dennis's response is what I talked to in the beginning of my presentation, which is that the vast majority of plays from the period have been lost, especially the vast majority of manuscript plays. It's really only the plays that were published that we still have. And had not half of Shakespeare's plays been published after his death, we wouldn't even have those. And the other argument that I would have for that is that if we had Thomas North's plays, then there wouldn't be a need for Dennis Mccarthy to go and actually, make do the research and have the theories that he has, that we would know the relationship between Shakespeare and Thomas North. So in some ways, just asking that question sort of begs the answer. And, it's something I know Dennis is actively trying to see, if there is a manuscript copy of one of Thomas North's plays in an archive somewhere. But it wouldn't be surprising if those plays had been lost, if indeed they ever existed.
Our next question is also an anonymous asker. You mentioned that you wanted to ensure that you didn't just take Dennis's story out of hand, but what did it take for you as a researcher to question your own history and education about Shakespeare and to allow what so many others would consider a radical concept?
Yeah, it was interesting for me, and there are places in the book. I don't mean to imply that I just sort of accepted all of Dennis's theories in whole cloth, and there are places in the book it goes along where I actually question some of the conclusions that he's come to, and find some of them less plausible than others. But I think for me, I've always been open-minded. I have worked as an investigative reporter, and in that line of work, I have always been open to stories and ideas that may seem far-fetched in the beginning, whether it's corporate malfeasance, or whether it's a crime that somebody committed, or whether even I used to, when I was at Boston Magazine, I would get letters from prisoners all the time saying they were innocent, and 9 times out of 10 they were guilty. But there was always that one time where they really were innocent, and I wrote some of the best articles of my career about those examples. And so I think just from my training alone, I'd always been sort of trained to keep those possibilities open. And again, when Dennis started sharing his information with me, and I just got to see how in-depth it was, it became harder and harder for me to argue against it.
All right, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. JP would like to know, have you or Dennis come across any documents from North's lifetime or shortly thereafter commenting on North as a playwright as opposed to a translator?
Yeah, that was actually a fascinating aspect of Dennis's research, is that when Thomas North was at Lincoln's Inn, he was actually, for a brief time, the master of revels there, which would be the person in charge of putting on plays. There was something else in the records, however, that said he was fined for not exercising that office. So it's unclear how many plays he actually put on. But then much later, there are these account records of Thomas North's brother that were meticulously kept, everything that he spent money on. And there are a number of accounts where Roger North actually spent some money on, either he paid it to the Earl of Leicester's group of players, or to other players. And in the same line, he has a payment to Thomas North. And there's even one payment that is the exact payment that you would give to the author of a play at court. And it's a really kind of crazy figure, which I'm not going to remember. It's £6, 8 shillings, 13 pence, or something like that. And so, again, it's all circumstantial. It's no smoking gun, but it's really compelling evidence that yes, perhaps Thomas North may have been a playwright and not just a translator.
So how good is that job title? Master of Revels? I love it.
I know, right?
So if you don't mind sticking around for 1 more question, I'd love to close out the hour with Elizabeth's question here. And she greatly enjoyed studying English literature in the late 70s, and she's very struck by Dennis's outsider status. There are many examples of those who approach a field unburdened by the chains of orthodoxy, breaking open that field in unique and valuable ways. What are the primary elements of Dennis's outsider position that make his breakthrough possible?
Yeah, it is a really good question, because, there are these examples all throughout history of, say, Darwin or Einstein, where somebody sort of comes in and really just changes what everyone thought was true. And usually they're rejected in the beginning, and it takes a long time for them to be believed. But of course, we don't know those people who sort of had these theories that were, changing everything that were not believed, and kind of lost to history. So I think in terms of what makes Dennis really special, though, is because he was just so independent in the way that he did his research, both in scientific research and in the Shakespearean research. It has really caused him to not look at things in a sort of orthodox way, where he's trying to sort of fit into the scholarship that's been done in the past. And it makes him really especially tuned to sort of follow the evidence that's in front of him. And, you know, what I really admire about Dennis is just his perseverance. He's been working on this for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
I should have said that he started this in 2005 was when he first started looking into Hamlet. So even more than 15 years now. And, you know, he's been sitting at his computer and he's been going to these texts and just taking these plays apart one by one and looking at these individual passages, and in some cases, reworking some of his own ideas and making it better. And I can honestly not say whether I would have had the perseverance, especially in the face of all that rejection, to go on with this struggle. But he's just, you know, really convinced that he's right. And he really is convinced that, you know, to use a Shakespearean phrase, the truth will out in the end. And eventually people will accept these ideas. And again, I think, you know, even if you don't accept all of Dennis's ideas, I think that I would agree that there's got to be something there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And
thank you.
Everyone, you'll be getting emails from us soon when your books are ready to be picked up or they're shipped out. And I know Michael will be stopping by the store to sign with you. So that's great. If you want to hear more about our events in the future, you can go to brooklinebooksmith.com/events. Michael, again, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in our audience.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It's really been a pleasure to talk tonight.
Good night.
Night.